Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I am Professor Daniel Chua. I am a professor of music here at the University of Hong Kong, and also... I'm not speaking tonight. So, Professor of Music here at the University of Hong Kong, and also a Director of Faith and Global Engagement. So welcome to the MacDonald Distinguished Lecture. We had a lecture about 2 months ago with the artist Makoto Fujimura, and next semester we'll have a scientist from the University of Oxford, Art Louis, coming to speak. But tonight we have a very special person from Harvard, and it's a pleasure, a great pleasure for me to introduce to you Professor Tyler Van der Wiel from Harvard University. Although, I mean, it was supposed to be a great pleasure introducing him until this morning when I was working on the introduction, and I suddenly had this unpleasurable experience as an academic of feeling totally and utterly inadequate is the best word. Because I don't know what planet Tyler comes from, but it's unbelievable what he's been able to achieve before, I don't know how old you are, before even 50, right? So he went to Oxford University and to the University of Pennsylvania and also to Harvard. But these are the qualifications that he got, right? 1, in mathematics. 2, in philosophy. 3, in theology. 4, in finance. And 5, in biostatistics. That's already crazy, right? But the craziest thing is he's somehow been able to combine all these different strands together. I mean, these are very diverse, even contradictory strands, all together to do groundbreaking work on human flourishing. That's pretty amazing. And he's published all this stuff in over 500 articles. And I think just in the space of like 3 or 4 years, he's also published 3 single-authored books, right? And this is in a field where you don't even have to publish books. So this is why, actually it's rather ironic because he works on human flourishing, but when I look at him, I feel like a withered flower, you know, as an academic. That's why I feel so inadequate. But there's one consolation for myself, and that is that Tyler has only managed to get a job at Harvard. Now, for those of you who've never heard of Harvard, Harvard tries to be the Hong Kong U of America. Okay, so Tyler, actually, I had an idea, you know, to complete your CV and to make you, you know, reach the pinnacle of your career. You should consider applying for a job here at the University of Hong Kong. I'm sure I can speak to the folks at Public Health. I'm sure they'll think about considering you for a post. Is that not correct? Yeah, I think so, right? It'd be very cool. You should think about it. But anyway, he's still at Harvard, and he has a very long title. I mean, it's a title that barely fits on a business card, and it took me the whole weekend to memorize it. So here it is. So Tyler Van der Wiel is the John L. Loeb and Francis Lehman Loeb Professor of Epidemiology in the Department of Epidemiology and the Department of Biostatistics at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Is that right? Thank you. And he's also director of the multi-million-dollar project on the Harvard Human Flourishing Program. And he's going to share a little bit of that research tonight. Now, when you came in, we were playing music from Pharrell Williams, the song called Happy. Do you know Happy? If you're a fan of the Minions, you would know the song Happy. And there's one line in that song that goes, clap along, you know, if you believe that happiness is the truth. So is happiness the truth? And what kind of truth is it? Is it some form of human flourishing? And if it is a form of human flourishing, then what are the human elements that might constitute that truth? And is there any science to back it up? Well, to answer some of these questions, and also more questions, please join me in welcoming Tyler Van der Wiel, who will give us an update on the good life. Tyler, over to you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. Do you want my mic, or you can have that one? Tyler's going to speak from over there. So, is that right?
I can.
Oh, you're gonna do a Daniel Chua? Okay, fantastic.
I will attempt that.
So yeah, this is good.
Impossible to do a Daniel.
Yeah. That's very good. Okay. So Tyler, everyone.
Yep. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming this evening. Thank you for the very kind introduction, Daniel, and I'm really delighted to be here and to be in Hong Kong. It is an extraordinary city, extraordinary community, and I've really enjoyed learning about HKU as well, and look forward to exploring potential partnerships. This evening, I will be discussing updating the good life, the Global Flourishing Study. I will be providing an overview of the framework that we've used to think about flourishing, and even to attempt to measure flourishing. And then we'll discuss efforts to collect data to understand the distribution and determinants of flourishing around the globe and the insights that we've had from this Global Flourishing Study. I'll then transition to questions of how do we not just study flourishing, but promote it as well. I'll begin with individual activities that can be helpful in the promotion of flourishing. I will move on to communities that are important for flourishing, and then broaden yet further and talk about broader policy considerations for flourishing. Because this is the McDonald Lecture at Daniel's request, I'll also talk about Christian visions of flourishing and the role of religious communities in greater detail. More information on the flourishing framework that I will be presenting today can be found in this 2017 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the Promotion of Human Flourishing, more on the Global Flourishing Study itself in this Nature Mental Health paper, and more information on the Human Flourishing program can be found in our website. We have some informational brochures in the back, though those may have all been taken at this point. We do have both information on the program, but also on the conceptual framework. All of that is also available online on our website. So many of our institutions and academic disciplines aspire to grand visions of flourishing. The World Health Organization's definition of health from 1948, still in place today, is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. The discipline of economics is sometimes described as an attempt to study how agents go about maximizing their expected utility, supposedly taking into account all aspects of an agent's preferences. The discipline of positive psychology has sometimes been described as the study of the strengths that enable individuals and communities to thrive. But in practice, many of our discussions, many of our studies, many of our measures focus on much narrower outcomes, simple disease states, or measures of feeling happy, or just income. They miss these broad visions of flourishing. So what is flourishing? Well, if we turn to our dictionaries, the Oxford English Dictionary defines flourish as to grow or develop in a healthy or vigorous way. The American Heritage Dictionary, to do or fare well. The etymology of the word comes from Latin, florere, to bloom, blossom, flower. It's the word often used to translate Aristotle's eudaimonia, sometimes also translated as happiness. The working definition of flourishing that we've used at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard is that flourishing is a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. So very all-encompassing. Defined thus, there are several important characteristics. First, flourishing is multidimensional. It includes all aspects of life. We may be flourishing in certain ways, but not others. We may be struggling with health, but feel we have good relationships. Or we may have a strong sense of purpose and calling, but feel we have to give up some personal happiness to attain that. But flourishing is multidimensional. Flourishing is also an ideal. It's not something we ever perfectly attain in this life. There is always room for improvement. Flourishing also, if it includes all aspects, includes then the context, communities, environments in which a person lives. And so I'll come back to that later on in our discussion as well. But it's broad, all-encompassing. But this is arguably what we are each seeking as individuals and really ought to be seeking as a society. But with a conception so broad, we might wonder, how do we really do this in practice? And I think the discipline that's perhaps tried to do this most adequately is that of positive psychology. Numerous assessments and conceptualizations of flourishing have been put forward. But notably absent from these psychological understandings of well-being is physical health. And are we really fully flourishing if we're terribly ill or if we're bedridden? Certainly we can be flourishing in certain ways, but surely full flourishing includes health as well. Missing from many, though not all of these conceptualizations and measures, is the notion of character or virtue, contrary to Plato, Aristotle, most of the Western philosophical tradition, and really philosophical religious traditions worldwide. But with a conception so broad, again, can we measure this? Can we ever possibly achieve consensus? Surely well-developed conceptions of flourishing will vary by culture and context and religion and philosophy. So can we really make any progress? And what I would argue is that while I do think it's the case that well-developed conceptions of flourishing do vary by tradition, I think a good place to begin is perhaps what's held in common. And so what I would argue is that whatever else flourishing might consist in, it would include the following 5 domains of human life as well. Not that flourishing is reducible to these 5, but I think any reasonable conception of flourishing would include these 5 domains of human life amongst other things as well. And I'll come back to that point later on. And these 5 are first happiness and life satisfaction, second physical and mental health, third meaning and purpose, fourth character and virtue, and fifth, close social relationships. Again, the argument's not that this exhausts flourishing, but that each of these things is a part of it. So happiness is a part of flourishing. It's not all of flourishing, but it's a part of flourishing. I think each of these 5 domains of human life also satisfies the following 2 criteria. Each is nearly universally desired, and we have empirical data on this now as well from the Global Flourishing Study. And each is also its own end. Each of these things is sought for its own sake. It's not merely a means to obtain some other end. And I think those 2 criteria of being an end, being nearly universally desired, might help shape some consensus around what to measure. So it's a very crude assessment of flourishing. We've taken 2 questions from each of these 5 domains, drawn principally from the existing literature on well-being, questions that are in fairly widespread use and that have received at least some degree of empirical validation. The only 2 questions here that are newly proposed are those around character and virtue. And while there's been a lot of good work over the last 20 years on character assessment, most of that's focused on fairly substantial assessments to assess kind of one single character strength. So maybe 20 questions to assess courage or 6 questions to assess creativity. There was much less that was global in nature. So we worked with philosophers to develop 2 questions based on the tradition of the cardinal virtues, that at the foundation of all moral virtues lie 4: practical wisdom, justice, fortitude or courage, and temperance or moderation. And so these 10 questions are as follows. First, happiness and life satisfaction domain. For all, how satisfied are you with life as a whole these days? Self-rated from 0, completely unsatisfied, to 10, completely satisfied. This is perhaps the most widely used question in the well-being literature. It's been used by the OECD in the UK's annual survey. It's been used by Gallup. It's used in US National Health Interview Survey and many other sources as well. Then we supplement that by something more effective. In general, how happy or unhappy do you usually feel? Again, self-rated from 0, extremely unhappy, to 10, extremely happy. The second domain, physical and mental health. These are just standard self-report health questions from the US General Social Survey and the World Health Organization's Mental Health Survey. In general, how would you rate your physical health, 0 to 10? How would you rate your overall mental health, 0 to 10? Third domain, meaning and purpose. First question overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? From 0, not at all worthwhile, to 10, completely worthwhile. This question is also widely used in the well-being literature, once again by the OECD and the UK's annual survey, by cohort studies throughout the world also. And then we supplement that with something more cognitive. I understand my purpose in life. From 0, completely disagree, to 10, completely agree. The fourth domain, character and virtue. The first question intended in some very crude way to try to get at notions of practical wisdom and justice. I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. 0, not at all true of me, to 10, completely true of me. And then a second question intended to get at some crude way towards notions of fortitude and temperance. I'm always able to give up some happiness now for greater happiness later. And then the fifth domain, close social relationships. These two questions were taken from the UK's Campaign to End Loneliness assessment of short social connectedness questions. First item here, I am content with my friendships and relationships. From 0, completely disagree, to 10, completely agree, intended to get at the quantity of those relationships. And then my relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be, trying to get at the quality of those relationships. We typically report results separately by domain because, as you'll see shortly, the dynamics can be quite different across these domains. Sometimes we will average these 10 questions for an overall crude assessment of flourishing, but really this should be understood as nothing other than the average of those 5 more meaningful domain assessments. We do typically also supplement these 10 questions with 2 others on financial and material security as important means to sustain those other ends. So these 2 questions drawn from the financial well-being literature. How often do you worry about being able to meet normal monthly living expenses? Self-rated from 0, worry all the time, to 10, do not worry at all. How often do you worry about safety, food, or housing? We'll typically report this domain separately as well. Sometimes we'll average all 12 questions for a more secure assessment of flourishing, perhaps less satisfactory conceptually, since financial resources are arguably means, not ends, but perhaps more satisfactory in practice in indicating flourishing over a longer period of time. I will be talking about various research uses that for which we've employed this measure and what we've learned, but I think the assessment can be helpful for reflection, for self-awareness at the individual level and at the community level as well, to understand what's going well, what's not, strengths and weaknesses, figuring out whether there are areas in life one wants to work on, changes to be made. When taken repeatedly over time, one can see what's getting better, what's staying the same, what may be getting worse, what might I do about this? Again, either at the individual or the community level. We've used this in various workplace, educational, clinical, neighborhood settings, and some of the feedback we've had, responses along the lines of some of the questions made me stop and think. It was pretty eye-opening to see the areas I really need to work on. Relief that someone is asking, I want help in certain areas. Slightly caught off guard with the questions around purpose. Missing a greater purpose, need to reach out to help and give back more. In one workplace context, simply after going through these 12 questions, a woman came up and said, I felt I'm missing a purpose, and I've been wrestling back and forth whether to commit to this volunteering activity, and after going through these 12 questions, I've decided to do so. So the questions themselves can serve as an intervention. And so with that, I am in fact going to pause for 2 minutes and allow you to think through these questions. Don't worry, I won't be collecting data here and now, but we'll do 2 minutes of self-reflection. We'll come back. So I realize 2 minutes is not a lot of time, but perhaps this has prompted thoughts to return to later. Again, I will be talking about research uses, but I think this can be helpful not just individually, but for communities as well. And I'll talk about some of those uses later on. I think it can be useful descriptively, even at a national level, also to see what's going well in a particular place, how are things changing over time? And even that descriptive data can give considerable insight. So we've been doing this with roughly nationally representative samples in the United States since 2020. In January of 2020, when we carried this out for the first time, the average scores across most of these domains in the United States was about 7, except for financial and material stability, essentially a full point lower. We did this 6 months later. January 2020 was shortly before the World Health Organization's declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we did this 6 months later in the midst of the pandemic. Unsurprisingly, flourishing scores went down. But what was interesting is different domains were affected in different ways. We saw a pretty substantial fall in happiness and life satisfaction, 0.7 of a point, perhaps not so surprising. Same with physical and mental health, 0.7 of a point, not so surprising. Pretty dramatic fall in financial and material stability. And June of 2020 was in fact the height of unemployment in the United States. But interestingly, some of the other domains did not fall as much. Meaning and purpose went down a little bit, but not as much as those other domains. Our character assessments were essentially level during this time, and somewhat surprisingly, social connectedness went down a little bit, but not all that much, and not as much as we would have anticipated. It seemed as though, while this may have been quite a difficult time for some, others found deeper connections within the home, or spent more time with relatives via Zoom or phone or other technologies. There was evidence that children felt closer to their fathers during the COVID-19 pandemic. Importantly, however, those change in means do disguise the variability. The variation, the standard deviation of all of these measures went up during the pandemic. And so while for some this may have been a time of relational investment within the home, for others, perhaps especially those living alone, this was a particularly difficult time. And so it's important that we pay attention not only to the means, but to the distribution and to those who may most need help. We've continued to collect this data over time. By January of 2021, there had been about a halfway recovery. By January 2022 in the United States, and this was amidst the Omicron variant, scores had pretty much returned to pre-pandemic levels. But in January 2022, a new pattern emerged, and that was with age. The traditional relationship between well-being and age and earlier data focused mostly just on happiness and life satisfaction has been U-shaped, with younger people and older people typically reporting higher, and those in midlife perhaps struggling with young children and aging parents and career challenges generally reporting lower. What has begun to happen over time, and this preceded the pandemic, was that left part of the U began flattening. That was exacerbated and accelerated by the pandemic itself. And in January of 2022, for the first time, we found each of these flourishing dimensions increasing with age. Young people are not doing as well as they used to be. And I think this raises real concerns with regard to, are we sufficiently investing in the well-being of young people? What can we do to support the well-being of the next generation and society as we move forward? We've collected this data in a variety of different settings: workplace with employees of Aetna, Kohler, Owens Corning, the World Bank, factory workers in Mexico, Poland, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, China, group of international flight attendants. Delta Airlines recently used this with all 80,000 of its employees. We've also embedded it in numerous epidemiologic cohort studies: the Nurses' Health Study at Harvard, the LSPEC study in the UK, the Japanese Aging and Gerontological Study. We've used it in various clinical settings with various universities, and have in fact launched an academic flourishing initiative to help universities collect this data and make sense of it and see how things changing over the years. And we welcome any university to participate with us in that. We've used this with secondary schools. The U.S. Catholic bishops use this for a survey of priests. We've used this in randomized trials of forgiveness, which I'll talk about later. The state of Tennessee has embedded these measures in randomized trials and are thinking about reevaluating their program approaches using these flourishing assessments. But our largest study to date is this Global Flourishing Study, a joint project between Harvard's Human Flourishing Program, Baylor, Gallup, funded by the Templeton Philanthropies and other organizations. This study is a study of over 200,000 individuals in 22 countries, representing over half of the world's population, with nationally representative samples in each country, and intended 5 years of annual data collection on these 12 flourishing questions, but on numerous other well-being questions, along with social, political, economic, community, spiritual, family determinants of flourishing. And we're trying to discern how flourishing is distributed, who needs most help, but also over time, what are the determinants of flourishing globally? What patterns seem to be universal and what patterns are perhaps culturally specific? The first wave of this data was released in February of 2024, the second wave in April of this year. We've nearly completed the third wave of data collection. This is an open access data resource available through the Center for Open Science. So any researchers out there who want to make use of it, we would most welcome that. We have teams at Harvard and Baylor working on this data, have published 70 papers in the last 6 months with the first wave of data alone, and we look forward to learning about flourishing, both in our own work and in that of others. Some of the initial insights from that first wave of data is when aggregated over the 22 countries, men and women seem to report roughly equal levels of flourishing if you were to average over those 12 questions. But there's variation across countries. Women report considerably higher flourishing than men in Japan. In Brazil, it's the reverse. Men report considerably higher flourishing than women. In many countries, that increasing with age pattern seems to be becoming common. That's the case not just in the United States, but also in Argentina, in Australia, in Brazil, in the United Kingdom, in Sweden. Not everywhere. Japan and India Egypt looks somewhat more U-shaped, and Hong Kong, it's almost J-shaped, where the young people aren't doing quite as well as the older people, but better still than those in midlife. But in Poland and Tanzania, flourishing is decreasing with age. So some of what we're trying to do now is to make sense of these patterns. Replicating a lot of past work on well-being, though focused mostly just on Western contexts and mostly just with happiness, we have found those who are employed, educated, married, or religious tend to report higher flourishing scores than those who do not. But not everywhere. Single individuals report higher flourishing than married individuals in India and Tanzania. Most countries, the pattern with education and flourishing is increasing flourishing with education. But not in Australia and not here in Hong Kong, where self-reported flourishing decreases with education. So again, why is this so? How do we make sense of this? This is what we're trying to do now with the subsequent waves of data as well. Different countries are also flourishing in different ways. Many of the richer developed countries report higher levels of overall life evaluation, higher levels of financial security. But the middle income countries tend to report higher levels of meaning and purpose, higher levels of greater pro-social character and orientation, higher relationship quality. The relationship between meaning in life and GDP per capita is negative with this data. And I think this raises really important questions with regard to how do we carry out economic development without compromising meaning and purpose, without compromising that pro-social character, without compromising our relationships. As one particularly dramatic example, Sweden, one of the Norwegian countries, one that usually does well in happiness rankings. The World Happiness Report usually reports them and other Scandinavian countries towards the top, using just a single question on overall life evaluation. And sure enough, if you look at that same question in our data, Sweden's second of the 22 countries. Once you throw in meaning in life, they report 19th of the 22 countries. Likewise, the United States does all right with happiness, but on social relationships, 17th of the 22 countries. So have we given up some of the elements of flourishing that are most central to our humanity in pursuit of economic gain? Have we got the balance right? What more might we do? And I'll come back to that question later on. But more on this, and some of the initial results can be found again in that paper in Nature, Human Behavior. I do now want to transition, however, to not just how do we study flourishing, what do we learn, but how might we promote it? And so starting at the individual level, I do think the discipline of positive psychology has been helpful in providing simple, easy, do-it-yourself activities that anyone can undertake to promote at least certain aspects of flourishing. And many of these simple activities have been studied in randomized trials. Perhaps the best studied of these is gratitude. 3 times a week, write down 3 things you're grateful for and why. Doing that versus some neutral activity has been shown in randomized trial after randomized trial to increase levels of happiness, reduce depression, improve sleep quality, reduce self-reported health symptoms. We do this around our dinner table at home, and I feel I can notice the weeks that we have forgotten to do so, the difference in our family life and dynamics. Another such example of an intervention is acts of kindness. Activities are something along the lines of, for 6 weeks, choose 1 day each week to carry out 5 acts of kindness that you wouldn't otherwise do. And it takes quite a bit of planning to get 5 in a single day, but the studies suggest that's more powerful than spreading them out over the course of the week. That need to plan, to think through it, begins to develop habits that encourage kindness more generally. Again, randomized trials indicating that those participating in this versus some neutral activity, higher levels of happiness, a greater sense of flow, connection with others. Another example is identify your chief character strengths. The VIA Institute, Values and Action Institute, have an assessment that anyone can take. Out of 24 character strengths, identify your top 5 and then use them in a new way, 1 each week for 5 weeks. Again, randomized trials indicating that this activity increases happiness, lowers depressive symptoms, even 6 months out. And then there are various other activities that I think one can use, workbooks, say, for depression, or anxiety, or forgiveness, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that have been shown in randomized trials likewise to have important effects on well-being. These are not substitutes for formal clinical care, but can help address more mild symptoms of depression or anxiety. We've tried to collect the evidence on some of these individual activities for flourishing in this 2020 paper, Activities for Flourishing, an Evidence-Based Guide. We also have a free flourishing app that implements these, but many of these can simply be done on one's own. And I do think if these were disseminated widely in communities, in schools, in workplaces, we'd see an increase in well-being. However, there are, of course, limits. And it is interesting that most of these randomized trials that have found effects, it's either been on happiness or on some aspect of health. The effects on these other aspects of flourishing, on meaning and purpose, on character, on relationships, are much less clear. Many of the interventions that have been designed to try to increase purpose in life have actually failed. Many of those studies are not even published. And I think to alter these other aspects of flourishing, we need something else. Self-directed individual activities aren't sufficient. We need communities. We need longer-term commitments and relationships. And so I'll move on to kind of more communal, institutional pathways to flourishing. And I'll be doing this through the lens of my own discipline, public health. We often think of the public health impact of an intervention or exposure or phenomenon as a function of 2 things. First, the prevalence of the exposure, how common it is in the population, and secondly, the size of its effects. Something that's common in the population that has large effects on the outcomes that we care about is going to shape population health. So if you use that perspective on physical health, we're led to things like exercise, nutrition, not smoking, adequate sleep. But if we broaden our lens and ask not just what affects physical health, but what affects also happiness, mental health, meaning, character, relationships, the list looks rather different. And based on a review of the literature restricted to the most rigorous longitudinal, experimental, and quasi-experimental designs, would propose 4. Family, work, education, and religious community. Evidence that each of these is relatively common worldwide. Each has relatively strong effects on those 5 aspects of flourishing. The argument here is not that these are exhaustive. There can be other activities that are very important in a person's life that might increase flourishing across those domains. Deep engagement in the arts, for example, might improve all those different aspects of flourishing, but such deep engagement is perhaps less common in the population. But the argument is not that these are exhaustive, nor that they're necessary. One can flourish in the absence of one or more of these pathways. The argument is that each of these does powerfully affect those domains of flourishing, and so if greater effort were made at the individual level to participate in these communal institutional pathways and to strengthen them from a societal perspective, that population flourishing would increase. If you'll allow me for a moment to put on my more methodologic, statistical hat, I'll talk a little bit about this particular review and study. Again, we restricted to longitudinal, experimental, quasi-experimental studies. Cross-sectional studies, where all the data was just collected at the same time, were excluded. And that's because often it's difficult, if not impossible, to discern causality from cross-sectional studies. It's a methodologic point, but it's an important one because I think it's one that really has plagued the well-being literature. As examples, known for many years that marriage and happiness are correlated. But is that because marriage gives rise to happiness, or is it because happy people are more likely to go on to get married? From cross-sectional data, we can't tell. There's clear evidence from longitudinal studies that both pathways are operative, but again, we can't tell from cross-sectional designs. Likewise, religious service attendance is associated with lower depression, but is that because religious service attendance prevents depression, or is it because those who become depressed withdraw from religious communities and other forms of community life as well? Again, from cross-sectional data, we can't tell. So we want, ideally, longitudinal data over time, multiple longitudinal studies, hopefully which we can combine in meta-analyses and that are moderately robust to unmeasured confounding. And in some cases, this involves discarding the vast majority of the studies. At the time this literature review was done in 2017, although there were over 100 studies on religion and happiness, I could find only one that was longitudinal in nature. There have been at least 6 or 7 since then. But again, we need to come back to this question of our evidence base. If we really want to promote flourishing and advance it, we need to have at least some evidence of causality. And so we need these methodologic restrictions. And so this figure has the 4 flourishing pathways on the left and the 5 flourishing domains on the right. The numbers on each of those arrows are references to one of these more rigorous studies providing evidence for an effect in that paper. In some cases, as of 2017, the evidence was quite substantial. In other cases, it was only 1 or 2 more rigorous studies supporting these pathways. A lot has been published since. I think the evidence base for each of these is even more profound. And so again, I do think these pathways are important. And I think the importance of these pathways also has potential policy implications. One could spend a whole lecture on this, so I'll keep my remarks relatively brief. But I think a lot of our policy considerations are shaped around just matters of either health or financial considerations. And those are important. Those are critical parts of life. But when we expand our lens to look at other aspects of flourishing, like meaning, character, relationships, I think it can change what we think might be best. For example, with regard to work, while I think many welfare policies are well-intentioned and in many ways necessary to provide material sustenance for people, to provide access to health care, I think we need to design those welfare systems in ways which don't disincentivize work. Because while for many, work does provide an income and material necessities, in the US, even often health insurance as well, work provides more than that. Work often provides a sense of purpose, a forum in which to build relationships, a way to make use of one's strengths. And so if we're disincentivizing work, we're ultimately compromising on flourishing as well. So I think supportive employment programs for the disadvantaged and mentally ill that help people find longer-term sustainable forms of work really are valuable, both in and of themselves as a contribution to society, but for the individual's flourishing also. I think similar policy considerations relate to marriage and family, to education, to religion as well. I think we should use this flourishing lens as we think about policy matters. And with that, I'd like to broaden our scope yet further and talk about flourishing at the societal level. And I want to come back and revisit this definition. Often in my own work and that of others, we'll use kind of flourishing and well-being almost interchangeably. But I do think there are subtle differences in the words flourishing, thriving, well-being. Thriving almost suggests doing well in spite of the environment. Flourishing, in contrast, suggests a certain consonance with the environment, that the environment itself is conducive to growth, conducive to one's own well-being. And so when we're trying to be precise and distinguish well-being and flourishing, the definition I had up earlier was that flourishing is a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. When we're trying to be more precise, I would say well-being is the relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good as they pertain to that individual. Whereas flourishing is a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including the contexts and communities and environments in which that person lives. So the community's well-being is part of one's own flourishing, both because it contributes to one's well-being, but also because of one's participation in the common good of the community. We might say that someone's attained a certain degree of well-being even in a corrupt society environment, but one's not fully flourishing because the community around oneself is not good. The community's well-being is part of one's own flourishing. And so really, if we are going to think about flourishing holistically as a society, we need to be looking at these notions of community well-being. We need to be considering matters of culture, language, religion, tradition, and how is this taking place? How is this playing out in the life of a society? This is, of course, not entirely straightforward to operationalize. We are taking a first attempt at this with the Global Flourishing Study data by mapping onto that framework that Dennis Noer at the University of Oxford has proposed, thinking about kind of the more societal, constitutive elements of well-being. And so his SAGE framework is based around 4 categories. First, within a society, notions of solidarity. Second, agency. Third, economic gain of the society itself, not just at the individual level. And fourth, the environment. And we're trying to map this onto the Global Flourishing Study data to look at those interrelations between notions of societal community well-being, these societal constituents of flourishing, and individual assessments of flourishing. So lot more to do here, but this is where we're trying to move this research and this thinking away from the very individualistic notions of well-being that often appear in both the psychology literature and elsewhere, to look at the communities and societal contexts. This is the McDonald Lecture, and so I was asked by Daniel to talk a little bit more about matters of faith, matters of religion, Christian perspectives on flourishing. And so I'll make a few remarks on this before moving towards my conclusion. But I would like to begin first with the empirical data on religious communities and flourishing. These studies here are from the Nurses' Health Study at Harvard, a cohort study of over 100,000 nurses that's been running for 40 years. And with an extensive array of health, demographic, and other assessments. And they have a simple measure of religious service attendance that's been measured every 4 years as part of a social support measure, but we looked at this frequency of religious service attendance question on its own, controlling for a host of other factors, baseline health, demographic, economic indicators, and we found even after that control, those attending services weekly or more versus not at all had a 33% lower mortality over 16 years. Another study translated these sorts of estimates into approximately 7 years of additional life. 27% lower depression over 4 or 8 years. 84% reduction in suicide. This is 5-fold, 6-fold reduction. Perhaps the strongest protective factor for suicide that we know. And effects on numerous other outcomes as well, those attending weekly versus not at all, lower levels of loneliness, of divorce, of substance use, greater levels of happiness, meaning, purpose, volunteering, civic engagement. I think churches and other religious communities play an important, a profound role in shaping societal flourishing. There's been a considerable concern in the United States of increasing suicide rates over the last 20 years after being fairly stable for nearly a century. These estimates would suggest that of that recent increase in suicide rates, about 40% of that's due to declining religious service attendance over the same period. So I think these matters of religious community are shaping population health and well-being, whether we look at them or study them or not. We've been trying to leverage ideas from religious communities as well, to disseminate them, and also to help religious communities and to help churches themselves flourish. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of our impact work in this space. Certainly throughout the world religions, there's at least some emphasis on forgiveness, but it is especially emphasized in the Christian religion. And it has been, believe it or not, focus of clinical psychology as well. What is forgiveness? How do we measure it? How do we promote it? And in collaboration with Everett Worthington, we've tried to distill about 30 years of work in clinical psychology on forgiveness into a 2 to 3 hour self-directed workbook. The last time I was in Hong Kong in 2019 was in fact to come here to help launch this forgiveness study. We ran this in 5 different relatively high conflict settings. Hong Kong in 2019 was one of them, along with Indonesia, Ukraine, Colombia, and South Africa. This study was of 4,500 individuals who were randomized either to use the workbook immediately or to wait a few weeks, and then we measured outcomes. And what we found is that this forgiveness workbook not only promoted forgiveness, but reduced depression, reduced anxiety, increased hope, improved flourishing. That letting go of that anger, those grudges, had profound effects on flourishing, on well-being. Forgiveness, understood as simply replacing ill will with goodwill towards the offender, does not necessarily imply reconciliation. It doesn't mean foregoing justice. It simply means changing one's attitude towards the offender, wanting ultimately what is good for them. And that provides a release, that provides flourishing. So it's been a pleasure to return to Hong Kong now that the study is finished and published, and we are trying to use this work to promote flourishing worldwide. We're trying to do this through churches, through schools, and through individuals. You can access, should you so desire, the free forgiveness workbook from our website. It's only 2 to 3 hours, though it is intense. I've used it a couple of times myself, and it can be really powerful, transformative experience. But we're also setting up forgiveness groups. It can sometimes be helpful to go through this process with others. And so if you're interested, or your church or religious community is interested, and we'll be getting to schools shortly, and implementing this, we welcome you to join in this work. We're also trying to help churches flourish. We're using these flourishing assessments, but also looking at community well-being. And we're supplementing this with assessments of spiritual well-being and also assessments of the church's contribution to the broader community through soup kitchens or medical services or other social support, to try to empower churches themselves to flourish. We have networks of churches in the United States interested in this, and now participating, moving towards Europe, and we would welcome participation from churches in Asia as well. But this work is grounded also in deeper notions of spiritual well-being. You'll notice that in those 5 domains that I put forward, spiritual well-being was not one of those. And I think while it is so important to many people around the world, how that's understood really does vary across the world religions, across traditions. I think to do this well, we need more tradition-specific perspectives. And so in my recent book, Theology of Health, have tried to work out a Christian vision for flourishing. And we've been doing assessments of spiritual well-being from a distinctively Christian perspective. The book is available, certainly through bookstores. It's also available for free as a PDF through Project Muse if you want to access it. But I think from a Christian perspective, hope is not simply flourishing here and now, but some sort of eternal flourishing in communion with God. In many contexts, I think that temporal and pursuit of eternal flourishing are consonant. We've seen that, at least on average, participation in church communities gives rise to these temporal flourishing domains. But that's not the case in all contexts. That would not have been the case in first century Rome. That's not the case for many who have suffered abuse in these church settings. Sometimes these pursuits can come apart. Sometimes there's real suffering involved. I think from a Christian perspective, when we have conflict between what we feel called to or the pursuit of that spiritual well-being with temporal aspects of flourishing, with our own happiness, say, it's really those eternal aspects that are to be prioritized. Sometimes I think we're also asked to suffer on behalf of others. We may be called to some difficult work, some difficult task, and have to give up elements of happiness or health or financial security to carry that work out. But if that is our calling, that is what is to be prioritized. And I think from the perspective of flourishing, including one's contexts, communities, in environments, that service, that contribution to the community's well-being is part of one's own flourishing. I was asked by a Jewish colleague not long ago, Tyler, was Jesus flourishing on the cross? I immediately responded yes, and then I thought, what on earth does that mean? And wrestled with this for a couple of weeks. And what I came to ultimately was, at least from the Christian perspective, from the Christian understanding, what was taking place on the cross and his death and subsequent resurrection was for the restoration of the world, the salvation of the world, the contribution from a Christian perspective to the world's well-being was profound, and that was his flourishing on the cross. But I think in smaller ways, we sometimes are also asked to contribute to the well-being of others at our own loss and sacrifice. But that, too, is part of our own flourishing, because the community's well-being is part of our flourishing. And sometimes that suffering can also give rise to transformation, a finding of new meanings, a clarification of purposes, a deepening of relationships, a growth in character, a clearer pursuit of spiritual well-being, of eternal flourishing. From a Christian perspective, I think our pursuit of that eternal flourishing of spiritual well-being is really to shape and to govern and to direct our pursuits of temporal flourishing. So if you're interested, more of that in the book. I will also be presenting tomorrow at 12:30 on the book and on this notion of theology of health wholeness and human flourishing. So with that, we'll move to concluding remarks. As I said, some of what we're doing now in terms of new directions is trying to take seriously these notions of tradition-specific well-being and looking across the world religions. Some of what we're also trying to do is look at communal notions of well-being, looking at matters of good relationships within the community, not just the average of the flourishing scores, but good relationships, good leadership, healthy structures and practices in place to sustain a community, a sense of welcome and belonging, a common mission. We're also doing more extensive assessments in each of these domains. 2 questions on meaning and purpose is hardly adequate to characterize how this plays out in a person's life. So across these domains, more extensive assessments. We've also tried to incorporate more non-Western perspectives. Much of the well-being literature on the empirical side really has been dominated by the US and Europe, and so we've been working with Japanese Wellbeing for Planet Earth Foundation to try to better understand what may be missed. Some of the early results of this is that while it's perhaps universally valued, there's much greater emphasis placed on notions of balance, peace, harmony in Eastern cultures than in the West. So we've incorporated these as well into the Global Flourishing Study. And then we've worked on adapting these approaches to more specific contexts, adolescents and even younger children, end-of-life context. What does it mean to flourish at the end of life? So this is some of what we're trying to do going ahead, but in summary, I do think flourishing pertains to all aspects of life. This is what we are seeking individually. This is what we should be seeking as a society, and we should be embedding this, I think, into our research, into our policies. I think our research, empirical studies should not be just looking at single outcomes, but a whole range of flourishing outcomes simultaneously. I think we need better research support for this work, for a broader set of outcomes. Yes, health and financial considerations are critical and have been rightly given emphasis, but we need to think more clearly about questions of meaning, of relationships, of character, if we're going to sustain societal flourishing. Government should start embedding these measures, I think, in their work to think through how do we carry out economic development without compromising meaning and purpose, character, relationships. Likewise, I think employers, medical centers, schools, universities should start doing this. And when we're launching new projects with schools and universities and would welcome participation. I truly believe what we measure shapes what we discuss, what we know, what we aim for, and the policies put in place to achieve those aims. I think we should be aiming for flourishing individually and as a society as well. Thank you all for being here and look forward to the discussion and questions.
Okay, is it on? It's inept. Okay, that's good. All right, Tyler, thank you so much for fascinating talk, but not just fascinating talk, but amazing research. I think we're all very grateful for the work that you're doing on this. So we have some time now for Q&A, but as always, there are 3 rules in faith and global engagement, A, B, and C. So A is please be articulate. In other words, please formulate the question first before trying to ask it. And also, please wait for a microphone so that we can hear your question. So please be articulate. That's A. B is please be brief. There are a lot of professors in this room. This is not a time for you to give a lecture on happiness and flourishing in Hong Kong, anything like that. You know, please make your question short, sharp, and sweet, okay? So that's very important. So be brief. And finally, C, be centered. Please focus on what we were talking about in this lecture today, okay? Focus on that. Don't ask random questions about Donald Trump or anything like that, right? It's not the time for that today, all right? Okay, so please be centered. A, B, and C. So are there any questions in the room? Because there's not much time, so please put your hand up if you have questions. Okay, that's great, we have questions. So we will have, we'll have a sort of like 2 or 3 questions and then we'll answer. Do you want a pen and a piece of paper? Maybe, I have a piece of paper for you.
Okay. No,
Oh, you do? Okay, that's terrific. All right. Okay, so hands up if a question. Okay, so we have a question here right at the front. How many microphones do we have? 2. Okay, a question here at the front, and there's a question there. The gentleman with lots of hair on his head in the blue shirt. Okay, here you go. There. Yeah, that guy. Okay, have your question first.
Professor
Please give us your name and then your question.
Professor Vanderveer, you said that in Japan, women reports much higher flourishing level than men. I wonder what is the reason under that extremely patriarchal society, especially before the first female prime minister.
Okay, question about Japan, and then what's your question?
Hi. Hi, thank you for the lecture. My name is Ryan. My question is very brief. What do you think is the biggest obstacle to the achievement of flourishing? And does it differ depending on where we are in the world?
Okay, a specific question and a huge one.
I think they are, in fact, partially related. I can't give a definitive answer on Japan, but my speculation from what we've seen across countries is that if you're using these questions to assess flourishing, then a sense of good relationships, a sense of meaning, a sense of serving others, caring for others, that pro-social orientation matter a lot. I mean, I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of the statistics that I reported. And, I do think that it is possible, you would be able to speak to this more than me, that even in that patriarchal society, the time spent on those more humanistic pursuits is greater for women than for men. The long work hours perhaps detract from these other aspects of flourishing. I will say these flourishing assessments are also the subjective side of flourishing, and that's not to diminish the importance of the objective side of flourishing. I think both are important, and we should be looking at both. We've done a pretty good job as a society looking at the objective measures, and I think a very bad job of looking at the subjective measures, and so we're trying to supplement that. But it is quite striking with Japan how much they diverge. In the subjective assessments, Japan reports lowest of the 22 countries. And some of it may be how the 0 to 10 scale is being interpreted and the inclination more to report towards the middle. But even if we ask binary yes-no questions, do you have someone close to who you can share things with? Of the 22 countries, they have the lowest proportion. And yet, life expectancy is very high. Crime is very low. These are important outcomes as well. And so, I think it is a critical question. How do we balance it? How do we pursue both? And I think for the most part, we haven't got the balance right. And so I think that relates to the second question: what are the biggest impediments? I'm not sure I would have said the same thing 50 years ago. But on many of the material aspects, while there's still work to be done, we have made tremendous progress. Proportions in extreme poverty have fallen from 43% to 9% over the last several decades. There's still more to do, there's still more to be done, but we've made a great deal of progress as well. And so I think looking globally, maybe what's keeping us from flourishing is the wrong set of values. Having not found the right balance, perhaps being too focused on the material aspects of flourishing. As I said, I think we need to find a way to carry out economic development, which is important, which is critical, but in ways that preserve meaning, relationships, character, so that we are caring for all of those around us, and so that we're further motivated to address the issues of material deprivation that still affect so many. So I do think our our values and whether we're getting that balance right may be the most important impediment to flourishing globally at present.
More questions? Put your hand up. Okay. Put your hands down if you're not a student. Okay, student. Okay, there's a student. There are two questions here. Oh no, yeah, you're not a student. So there's a question here, and there's a question from the gentleman over there in the black. Yeah, yeah. So let's have two questions here.
First of all, thank you very much for the speech. I think my question is more like a question, but also study research question. Since you mentioned you've been doing some research in Ukraine as well, data collection, but you probably stopped during the war. It's amazing all the studies you have done, but have you considered maybe after the war ends, doing like, it might be the perfect opportunity to test and implement everything you've discovered during those researches. So have you ever thought of basically doing a huge data collection after the war ends to measure what are the key concepts of flourishing, how we can flourish a population that is damaged, and the 5 topics you mentioned, financially, physically, mentally. So have you ever thought about doing this?
Yeah. Hello. My name is Arjun, and thank you for that fascinating presentation. I will refer to 2 slides. First, the global map that you put up, which has 22 countries, but not the countries which are affected by conflict as we talk. Number 2 is you talk about flourishing. So can we go back? Yeah, thank you so much for that. So we don't have, so my first part of the question is you don't have Ukraine, Russia there, you don't have Israel, Gaza, anywhere, and you don't have DR Congo. So even from the Christian angle, where the majority of the religion in Ukraine or in DR Congo is Christianity, what are we looking at in this study there? Number 2 is we are sitting in a land, I come from India, this is China, these are ancient civilizations. What can civilizational values and learnings and literature add to flourishing? Because this looks a bit skewed in terms of Western knowledge systems. Thank you.
So 3 questions, really.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
And once again, I think there's a close relation. Yeah, it's true. We don't have countries that and areas that are in the midst of war. We did have initially Ukraine and Russia as 2 of the countries, and we tried to keep them in. It is more difficult to carry out nationally representative data collection in the midst of conflict. In the case of Russia, it was the financial sanctions, and we couldn't find a way around that. Ukraine, it was pretty clear, early on that this was going to be impossible. But they were two countries, so it is difficult to run these sorts of studies in those settings. I think it can be done, but it requires tremendous focus, patience, perseverance. We couldn't do something at scale like this in numerous countries. But that's why we have collaborators who are working with war-torn settings, former child soldiers in the Sierra Leone. And there are real struggles in doing that, but it's important. It's important to learn about how we can promote flourishing. I do think there are lessons that can be drawn from the broader flourishing studies that we've been doing about the importance of community and rebuilding those communities and trying to preserve them. But I think there's a lot that's going to be specific to a post-war context that goes beyond what we can discern from this data. On the overly Western conceptualizations, again, these 12 questions are not all that's in the Global Flourishing Study. We did release the initial survey draft in advance. We got feedback from scholars, 160 scholars around the world. We tried to take in a lot of that. Inevitably, the survey is still skewed towards more Western perspective. So I think it was a helpful step, but it was only a step. What we do have at least is that more global coverage. Again, the well-being literature is tremendously skewed in terms of the samples towards the west. So the geographic coverage was a step, but once again, only a step, and there's more that should be done. And in our commentary in Nature, we describe how each country should likewise reflect on what its understanding of well-being is, what its priorities are, and those should be used to shape data collection within countries as well. So I very much embrace the vision of that, and hope to do what we can with regard to implementation. But I think a lot of that needs to happen not with a global scale, but within each individual country, and same with the question of how do you address the situation post-war. So some of these insights I think can be helpful, but as usual, there's more to be done.
You mentioned that you were working with the Japanese colleagues in looking at more Asian perspectives on some of these things. So about, say, with these ancient civilizations of China, India, and so on. Are you going to take more of that sort of information in to see whether you can get a kind of more, well, sort of a broader view, let's say, of what flourishing might be?
Yeah, so again, some of that we've tried to do already, and we've incorporated notions of balance, peace, and harmony into the Global Flourishing Study. The other piece that emerged fairly clearly are kind of notions of family well-being, and that really being quite critical to the understanding of one's own flourishing, more so in the East than in the West. And I, as per the presentation, fully embraced that notion, that understanding of flourishing. And we are hoping in either waves 4 or 5 of the study, at least in some countries with some subsamples, to do assessments of the not just focal individual, but the entire family, to try to better uncover these dynamics. Again, that's always going to be imperfect unless the study is tailored to each country and context. So would encourage others to do so and be happy to partner, but fairly early on decision was made for feasibility that we needed the same questions across these countries, and tried to take into account the global feedback we have. But we went in knowing that this was still skewed towards more Western perspectives.
Okay. Any professors with questions? Put up your hand. Yes, there's one question here. Any more? And another one there. Okay, so let's have the one there, and you can have my mic.
Thank you for your very meaningful study. I'm Jacqueline Lam. So my postulation is that maybe there are two types, as you mentioned, two types of flourishing, and one is spiritual flourishing. The other is general flourishing, which could be material or economic flourishing. So ultimately, the question for Christians would be, would that lead to spiritual flourishing? Material or general flourishing may or may not lead to spiritual flourishing. When you talk about flourishing, are you covering the two areas in your survey? And how can we finally measure the spiritual flourishing? Because in the Christian world, maybe material might not be necessary for the spiritual flourishing.
Okay, that's one. Do you want the other question? Okay, let's have the second question.
Thank you, Professor. Very inspiring talk. I was wondering whether there is already research data on to what extent doctors have been including some of these domains that are including the flourishing concept in their usual practice.
Okay. So with regard to the first question, in very much the same way that we didn't tailor the questions to the specific culture or civilization of each country, same with matters of religion and spiritual well-being. We were using the same questions. We have assessments of spirituality and prayer and meditation and community participation, and a handful of questions on belief and religious coping, and we tried to update the proposals for these assessments based on a more global understanding, but it was kind of a reduction to the lowest common denominator. What sorts of questions would be appreciated and common across settings? So there's no real Christian spiritual well-being in this assessment. We are doing that in our work with churches. We are have developed assessments of things like faith, hope, and love, as well as time in prayer, connection with God, and so on and so forth. And I do think to study spiritual well-being well, it needs to be done separately across religious traditions. And this is something where we are trying to advance, because I do genuinely believe these matters should be taken seriously, even in the context of a pluralistic society. If so much of the world's population feels this is what's most important to them, then surely we should have some sort of sense and assessments as to whether these different religious communities feel they're attaining or not those ends which they deem most important. So I think even in the context of a pluralistic society, if this is done well, you could have different religious groups trying to assess whether they see themselves as progressing in this manner or not. How to navigate that well is going to depend on the form of government and so on and so forth. I'm not pretending that this is straightforward, but I think at least having that information is helpful. So that's the direction we're trying to move, and because the greatest expertise that we have at the Human Flourishing Program is with the Christian faith. That's where we're beginning. But we have one of our researchers is looking at Muslim understandings of well-being, and another at Buddhist understandings. And this will be a longer-term project, but I think worthwhile from the perspective of one's own religious community, and from my perspective from the community that is the church. But again, I think of value in pluralistic context as well to do across the world religions. With regard to medicine, we've published a few pieces on flourishing in medicine. I do think these considerations are perhaps not always relevant for an annual checkup, but when there are major treatment decisions being made that have consequences and side effects that may affect one's flourishing, I think these matters should be taken seriously. And so we've been trying to push this in the medical world. There's been interest in uptake, but it's been principally with the clinicians themselves. Are the clinicians flourishing? How can we prevent burnout? And I think that's another helpful use in our study of residents at Johns Hopkins University. We found across those 6 domains where they very clearly scored lowest was physical and mental health. And so, what does it mean that we're training the next generation of physicians, and it's health that they're most struggling with? So I think these considerations are relevant for clinicians, but I'd like to see it embedded into patient care. Had a surgeon come to me not long ago saying, Tyler, we know from our randomized trials that our surgeries improve years of disease-free survival, but I'll have patients return to me 6 months later saying they want to die because the side effects have been so bad. What do we make of this? And so I think this is where that flourishing framework really comes in again. We should be, to my mind, embedding these flourishing measures in randomized trials as secondary outcomes so that there's an understanding of the trade-offs of different treatment options. So again, we've had much more success with the clinicians than with patient care thus far, but I do think there's a real role and relevance of this framework within medicine as well.
More questions? Maybe from the back? I noticed I've only been pointing at the front. So any more? Yes. One from Carl over there, and there's another one that, let's have those two first. These two gentlemen. I'm not doing very well here. This gentleman in the black shirt, and then can you get the microphone to Carl? There we go.
Thanks. All right. I was just wondering if you could say more about flourishing at the end of life. I know you actually wrote a paper on that a few months ago, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I think it's a really interesting question, and it's something we're thinking about more in Hong Kong, kind of having a conversation around assisted dying and flourishing at end of life. So if you'd like to comment more on that.
Yeah. And the second question?
My question is about how do you, did your studies also consider the impact of AI on our society, on the community? Because increasingly we are facing scams every day and all that, people impersonating your relatives or even your mother, and so how can we flourish under such a impact going forward? Thank you.
Thank you for both questions. I think challenging questions, challenging context. So about a year ago, we published a paper on flourishing at the end of life, as well as an adaptation of this assessment for end-of-life contexts. And I think here that multidimensional notion of flourishing really is important. Certainly at the end of life, one is not flourishing in certain ways. Health is deteriorating. Life is coming to an end. But I think one can flourish in other ways. And if one looks across those domains, I think especially those domains of meaning, of relationships, of character can be especially important. In some ways, one can flourish in unique ways at the end of life across those domains. With regard to meaning, I think it provides an opportunity to make sense of the whole trajectory of one's life, to make sense of the narrative in a way that one can't really do in the middle of life. Life could go in different directions. One doesn't really know entirely, but the end-of-life context allows one to try to find meaning in the whole of life. Now, likewise, with relationships, I think one can try to bring about reconciliation with torn relationships, trying to end relationships well. Traditional marriage vows of till death do us part, in some ways find their fulfillment at that moment of death. And so, once again, I think there are unique ways that flourishing can take place at the end of life. Likewise, often people are struggling with pain or facing the end, but I think that can also give rise to growth in characters. One works through those struggles, or for those who are religious, a deeper spiritual orientation. And so I think having an appreciation of ways one can flourish at the end of life, even though one is not flourishing in other ways, is important. And I do think this can come to bear on end-of-life discussions and discussions around physician-assisted aid in dying. I think a lot of that shaped around health, happiness, and financial considerations. And if that's all you're looking at, for some, at least, it might make sense to proceed in an early termination of life. But I think once one brings in notions of meaning, of character, of relationships, the picture can look quite different. And so, while a lot of this is shaped by one's moral framework and understanding, I do think flourishing has a role to play in that conversation as well, and once again can broaden our lens in terms of the sets of considerations that we're thinking about. Flourishing in AI is, I think, another challenging context, and while I do think there's potential for AI technologies to promote flourishing with information synthesis, with planning travel itineraries, with statistical analysis of data, of simplifying tasks. I think there's tremendous dangers as well, and I think we need to be attentive to them. We've recently released a white paper on flourishing considerations for AI, where we try to work through kind of using that flourishing lens, thinking about the effects of these technologies on our happiness, our health, our meaning, our character, our relationships, and our financial security, which is relevant as well. How do we shape LLM responses to be conducive rather than a hindrance to flourishing? Likewise, what sorts of products and applications are we making use of? What sorts of practices are we developing as individuals and as communities to regulate our use and extent of our use? I do think some of the responsibility lies with the developers of the technology, but some of it also relies with us. What are the implications for knowledge, and what does it mean to flourish as a human person? I think we cannot outsource our reasoning. We cannot outsource our relationships. We cannot outsource our creative endeavors, cannot outsource our joy and expect to flourish as persons. And so I think there are real threats. While some of the threats are common to all forms of new technology with regard to whose work is this displacing and how do we ensure better uses and try to prevent worse uses, I do think there are some unique aspects. And what concerns me the most are the relational chatbots. I think what's happening there is unlike anything in human history. The capacity to simulate a relationship is, I think, not something we've ever experienced before, and I think can be addictive, and may temporarily even alleviate loneliness, but I think long-term it's going to do tremendous damage to our relationships, to our social fabric. It's setting expectations that are totally unrealistic in a human relationship. It is decreasing our capacity for real relationships, and that's a lowering of our flourishing. So any use of these technologies, which is impeding our capacity to reason or to carry out creative artistic endeavors, or our ability to enter relationships, I think is hindering our flourishing. So I think we need serious reflection on these matters. I'm willing to go out on a limb in this point and to just say I think relational chatbot should be banned completely. I think there's going to be long-term damage. I think what we saw with social media is tiny compared to what we may have with these relational chatbots. And I think there are other simple things that can be done. Yes, the technologies are advancing very rapidly, and we can't predict always how the large language models are going to respond. But there are certain simple overrides, like saying every 10 minutes, just have a prompt saying, might this be a good time to stop using this and to read a book or talk to a friend? Likewise, every 10 minutes, I am not a human person, just as a reminder. For many, that might not do anything and just persist. I think for some, it's kind of a wake-up moment. And yeah, probably it would be good for me to stop. And that's something we can do now. That's something we can do regardless of how these technologies evolve. So I think there are things we can do to try to limit the harm. I think there are things we can try to do to leverage the benefit as well. But I do think we need to be thinking about this critically. And I do think that flourishing lens provides one way to try to make sense of this and to evaluate technologies.
Now, we really run out of time, but I do have one burning question. So you have to answer this really very quickly. Both of us are in education. We're in universities. Given your studies and what you've been looking at, is there anything different we should do at university?
Yeah, I think what we should be doing at universities is returning to often the grand aspirational mission and vision statements that so many of our institutions have on the transformation of students, on preparing citizen leaders for the next generation, on contributing to the world to make it a better place. There are always improvements we can make in our curriculum and teaching, and I think that's important too. But we've been doing that for a long time. I think what we've missed and what we've had declines in are trying to attain those grander aspirations. And so this is some of what we're trying to do at the Human Flourishing Program as well. Through the Academic Flourishing Initiative, we've developed a set of 24 questions asking about student perceptions of the contribution of university life to their growth and wisdom, to their capacity for leadership, to finding meaning, to being able to work across political or religious differences, to becoming more courageous, to learning and having the capacity for critical thought. And we're helping universities to make sense of this data, to look at how this varies across different demographic groups. How does this change across the 4 years, say, of a student's undergraduate education? In our pilot work with UNC, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where we did campus-wide data collection, we did see every year, they said the university had contributed more and more to their knowledge, to their capacity for critical thinking. But the character assessments were kind of flat. Same with leadership, and some aspects of the contribution of university life to character went down. The lowest reported score was the contribution of university life to their growth and honesty. And that got worse every year over the 4 years. What does that mean? Is this related to the use of AI technologies? What can be done? I think these insights help us discern what we should focus on. We did manage to include 4 of these questions in the Wall Street Journal's survey of U.S. colleges and universities. So we have data on 429 institutions. We recently released an alternative ranking on student perceptions of the contribution of university life to their own growth and wisdom. Harvard's about in the middle of the pack. But again, trying to help universities discern these matters, and then coming together as a community of practice for institutions that have strengths in particular areas, for them to reflect on how might this have come about? What can we learn from each other? How do we strengthen areas of weakness? But I think we've, for the most part, lost that vision of trying to transform student lives, of trying to develop citizen leaders. We've sort of taken the view, well, this will happen if we just give them a good education and the credential. And some of it, of course, does happen, but I think there's more that can be done. So if I were to point to one thing, I'd say...
No, that's great. That's really great. So just 2 things to end. One is Tyler is speaking tomorrow at 12:30, the arts faculty in the Arts Tech Lab. If you want more information, we'll put that up on the screen later. And the second thing is, do you want a job at Hong Kong U? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Tyler van der Weel.
I do often joke that my own flourishing scores would be considerably higher if it weren't for the Human Flourishing Program and the Global Flourishing Study. So
Yeah, Harvard's not that great.
Maybe in some years. Yet I feel a sense of calling to do this work, and that the contribution to the community's well-being is a part of my own flourishing. So
Yeah.
not now, but maybe later.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, really appreciate it. Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. So good.